much on the very infamous Gonzaga to the Big East front in recent weeks, but that doesn't mean we can't discuss what that could look like from the perspective of a diehard Creighton fan and analyst, which we are going to do right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, more odds, and more lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. I am thrilled to be joined today by Matt DeMarinis. Matt is a writer and podcaster for White and Blue Review. It is a website dedicated to all things Creighton Bluejays athletics. Matt, I know you've covered volleyball, you've covered soccer, you've covered basketball. Very excited to talk to you about Creighton, about the Big East. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, Andy, it's good to link back up with you. I love the intro and the whole deal you got going on. Yeah. I don't remember it being quite this much flair last time.
I think the last time you were on my show, man, I think the last time you were on my show was when it was Score Zag Score. And so it's been, it's through a different organization now. So yeah, it's there's a little bit of a glow up, a little bit of a come up with the new video, new fanciness, but I'm still very excited to get a chance to talk to you.
For sure. I dig it. Let's do it.
All right. Well, let's get right into it. So conference realignment, as you know, has kind of dominated the headlines for college sports for the last couple months, especially after USC and UCLA decided to head east. They bounced out of the Pac-12, heading to the Big Ten starting in 2024. I think when that first happened a couple months ago, there was a lot of feeling or belief or anxiety, depending on who you talk to, that there was going to be this huge wave of realignment and that a whole bunch of other schools were going to change and that there was only going to be like two conferences. And some of that was a little bit overblown. Certainly we haven't seen Oregon or Washington or Notre Dame or any other big schools make any moves. But one of the topics that came up quite a bit was the potential for Gonzaga to join the Big East, which is something that's been talked about well before this summer. It's a very natural fit when you just look at really good basketball programs that don't have football. They kind of make a lot of sense. But I really wanted to get a chance to chat with you and just kind of hear we look at it so much from the Gonzaga perspective, and I'd love to hear what somebody else who follows the Big East, somebody else who is a fan of a Big East school, kind of what the impression is or the thoughts are about the potential of Gonzaga joining the conference.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about realignment and how it kind of dominates conversation is it just kind of comes out of the blue, and then all of a sudden people start to get wide-eyed about it. I think the UCLA, USC thing kind of hit people with their guard down a little bit, and then they started to kind of zoom out a little bit. Wait a second. If USC and UCLA were planning this behind the scenes, what else is going on, kind of thing. Right. So, you saw how quickly the Big 12 fell apart with Texas and Oklahoma moving out of the SEC. Like, it just kind of happens, and then people start to try to see how far the ball will roll. In regards to the Big East and Gonzaga, I don't know if I am in the majority on this, but because I do get a lot of pushback every time I kind of just like throw the tweet out there, like it's kind of like fishing bait at this point. You always get some kind of a conversation out of it. I don't know. I look at this thing, and maybe I'm doing it wrong, because I think a lot of people look at it from just the major sports perspective. Like, if you're talking about expansion, it's basically the question is, how does it affect football and how does it affect men's basketball, right?
Right.
And that's the gist of the conversation, essentially.
Sure.
And especially in the mainstream, right? Like, people can't be bothered to dig into how it affects women's soccer. And I thought it was a bit of a nice stroke of little, coincidental destiny that Creighton and Gonzaga played.
Yeah, I saw that
this fall in women's soccer. And last year when we were talking about Kansas and the Big 12 kind of having some upheaval, Creighton and Kansas played in women's soccer as well. So it's just like, you know what? It's just they're just there. It's kind of makes sense already. I look at it from an all sports perspective, and I don't know how that fits with Gonzaga either, because if they're sitting out there on the West Coast and they're trying to find some, some stable ground to advance itself into the 21st century as an athletic program, what is that like? What are they really trying to do as an athletic department, right? Are they trying to find a home for men's basketball that just, that's a healthy conference that can bring in a lot of revenue, and they can just feed that into their other sports and sustain itself that way, or they can stick their other sports in whatever league they need to, that makes sense for them from a financial standpoint. I don't ever look at it like that, and maybe I'm wrong for doing that, but I just feel like Gonzaga as a whole fits the Big East when you look at the profiles of all the sports that Gonzaga offers. I think when you look at, because they get, obviously it's, when you think of Gonzaga, you think of men's basketball. Same thing for Creighton. Same thing for, you can name a school and kind of pick what they're known for, right? Same thing with Kansas. But Gonzaga has a healthy athletic department, in my opinion. I think, when you look at their women's soccer program right now, I think under this new coaching staff that's been there maybe, I think 4 or 5 years.
Sounds right.
You see like an upward trajectory here. And this team they've got coming back this year that Creighton just played, a lot of returners, barely miss the NCAA tournament, play a quality schedule. They play tough teams. They're really talented. They play a good style. I think that fits with Big East women's soccer. You look at baseball, solid program. They turn out pros. They're maybe not a consistent regional threat every year, but when they put the right core of veterans and talent together, they're a team is a tough out when they get to a regional. That's kind of fits the Big East. You know what I mean? Every now and then a Big East team will kind of have a veteran laden core, a lot of MLB draft talent. And they'll have a regional where they may even win one, go to a super, push some teams. So that fits the Big East profile for baseball. I don't, volleyball, I don't know what Gonzaga is kind of.
It's not their strongest sport.
It's not their best sport, right? But then Big East volleyball is kind of a 2-team race for the last, 5+ years anyway, with Creighton and Marquette. So if you're looking how Gonzaga fits in there, well, they kind of fit with everybody else, other than that's not a top 25 program. So again, they wouldn't be climbing uphill there. Women's basketball, incredible program. I think one of the more underrated women's basketball programs in the country. If you look at the momentum they have going right now, constantly flirting with that top 30, top 25, top 40-ish RPI or net. Talent, great style. Now they just made the NCAA tournament this last year, beat Nebraska pretty handily, in my opinion. In that 8-9 game. So they have a healthy program there, and then men's basketball kind of just speaks for itself. So when I look at it from how does Gonzaga fit the Big East, men's basketball is a no-brainer. I don't even think it's a debate. It's all honestly the only thing people push back on now is just like, well, what about the travel? I mean, we're in this day and age, I think that kind of takes care of itself, right? With the way everybody travels, especially for men's basketball. But they also fit in other sports, and I think it just makes sense. So, it started out as something that's kind of like pie in the sky, but as conferences start to consolidate more and more, you start to look for partners that fit, and schools that just like have healthy athletic departments that aren't going to drag you down, that have some sustainability. And it just seems like the Big East and Gonzaga are partners in the making.
I agree 100%. And I love that you brought up some of the other sports, because that has been one of the primary conversations that Gonzaga fans have been having is how that would fit in. And I do think that Gonzaga and the Big East line up really well on basically every sport. But there's obviously the question of finances, of travel. Is that going to work? And like you said, Gonzaga would probably, or could conceivably at least, funnel some of the added, media rights, TV revenue, streaming from the Big East, and funnel that money down to their other programs who are going to need more money, because their, I think, closest team that they're going to play in the Big East is probably Creighton, and that's not very close. And so that's a challenge. And a lot of people have kind of brought up, which I always think is interesting. They're like, well, why don't we just move basketball, men's and women's basketball, and leave the rest of our sports in the WCC? And I was like, look, I've spoken to Gloria Navarez, the commissioner of the WCC. She loves Gonzaga. There's not a chance in hell that she's going to say, yeah, you can take the biggest moneymaker that our entire conference has. You can leave with it and we'll just keep the rest of your. They're not going to do that. Like, that's not an option. And so, and if you're the new athletic director at Gonzaga, you can't go to your baseball coach and say, hey, so we're going to shove you guys in the big sky and we're going to take our basketball program and we're going to move out to the, like, that's not an option either. So the only really realistic option is taking every sport into the Big East. And it's encouraging, hearing you kind of talk about some of those other programs that you follow very closely. The Gonzaga makes a lot of sense. They fit from a women's soccer from a perspective, a little bit from a volleyball perspective, baseball, absolutely. The other Olympic sports, I think is a natural fit, but it is going to be a little tough to convince some of your student athletes or prospective student athletes or donors or whomever, like, hey, we're going to be spending a lot of money to fly our volleyball program out to the East Coast a couple times a year. Like, that's a tough sell, but the appeal of Gonzaga playing Villanova and Creighton and Xavier, and since it's go on and on and on and on, is pretty appealing. It's hard to not want that, even if it means some of this other stuff's going to be a little bit more challenging.
That's the one kind of scary part for Gonzaga that you kind of wonder about. I think the reason that there's a lot of public pushback from it when like people out here and even on the East Coast just mention it, right, is they don't think in terms of the non-men's basketball side of things.
Right.
Because like for us, when we know those other sports and we kind of have an idea of what they're about,
right,
in terms of results, in terms of what they are as programs, I think it's a no-brainer. And if anyone wanted to have an honest conversation about that, that's in my area, as far as Midwest and moving out towards the New York area.
Yeah.
I mean, I can do that in my sleep. It is. Yeah. I can check every box that every team in the Big East has gone through. And I can do the same thing with Kansas. People think I'm crazy for mentioning Kansas. But once you brought UConn back into the fold, you introduced an athletic program that is just like Kansas, essentially. When you look at, they've got one dominant sport that they care a lot about, and the rest of it, as you go down, it's like they're really good in volleyball, okay in baseball, women's soccer, meh. Like, you just move on down. You're like, everything fits in the Big East, right? In terms of what you care about, what you invest in, what you're good at. Gonzaga is the same thing. So, in my opinion, whenever we talk expansion for the Big East, everyone kind of stays in the Midwest and talks about Dayton, St. Louis, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, I think about it more in terms of who's doing what athletically. How does that fit the league? And two, what kind of TV markets are you talking about? Because that's really what expansion is about, right? We can talk about that now on the table. It's not about anything else in terms of geography or nonsense like that. It's about TV rights and media revenue and things like that.
Yeah, that is
Gonzaga and Kansas, when you're looking at markets that aren't not tapped into yet, that the Big East could potentially funnel into, that doesn't have to be. I don't know anything else that makes any more sense than those two.
Yeah, I want, since you mentioned Kansas, that's kind of a perfect segue into the last question I had here in this segment. The non-football basketball talent in Kansas, they're not non-football. They clearly do have a football program, but when you talk about, like, the Big East has, outside of Gonzaga, all of the non-football, the best basketball programs that don't have football. Basically, every single one of them is in the Big East, with the exception of Gonzaga. There's St. Mary's, there's other good programs, but that's the majority. Do you think that we've talked about how much expansion, expansion, realignment, all of that, how much it involves consolidating talent. Do you think that consolidating all of the non-football talent, or if we were to include Kansas, basically the best programs, the best basketball programs that have little football or no football, do you think it's a good thing to consolidate all of that? Or do you think that having the talent more spread out across conferences is better?
Well, I mean, I think having a geography-based conference in terms of your athletes and their families is better. You know what I mean? Because that's really what you want to be able, when you're sending your child or loved one off to school, or they're making a decision on what school they want to go to, they really want something that's kind of in their family radius, that their loved ones can come see them on a semi-regular basis at the very worst, right? I think we've burned that bridge and urinated all over its ashes. Like, I don't know what's left to go back to in that regard. So at this point, if you're trying to still maintain that authenticity from a geographical standpoint,
Yeah.
I don't think you're living in the century you need to be living in order to sustain yourself as a conference.
Yep.
I think I think you can try.
Yeah.
You can try to do it from an honest angle like that and try to
Mhm.
say this is what we're about. But I think you're gonna get picked off eventually
Yep.
because someone's gonna come for your assets. That's
Yep.
just what's been happening.
Yep.
So if Gonzaga is in a league right now that is geographically centered to its recruiting base and the teams it plays in,
Mhm.
they're going to get picked off by somebody. It
Yep.
only takes one team to
Mhm.
make the jump to crater the rest of the league, and then
Yep.
you're left holding what? You know what I
Yep.
mean?
Exactly.
So I do agree with the sentiment that
Mhm.
geographically based conferences is the better
Mhm.
way to go about it, especially
Right.
from the athlete
Mhm.
family standpoint.
Mhm.
We're
Yeah,
way
we're just past it.
yeah, it's not even worth revisiting because it's not the way people are operating anymore.
Yep.
So from that perspective, you look for assets,
Yep.
and Gonzaga has a lot of assets that fit with the Big East. I think
Yep.
same with Kansas.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are
Mhm.
in my opinion, those are the two starters.
Yep.
I understand there's there's worry that this
Mhm.
world is going to become too consolidated, and you'll have
Mhm.
leagues that sometimes don't even play. You won't even play that team that year. That kind of
Yeah.
it's kind of a mess to think about, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty intimidating to even plan out, especially when you think about conference tournaments and things like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Um, but if you want to keep it simple, right now the Big East is at 11.
Mhm.
Kansas and Gonzaga makes it 13. Again, you're
Mhm.
not even talking about the biggest conferences in the last 10 years.
No.
So
Yep.
it's
Absolutely.
it's it's a small way to jump
Mhm.
at some big fish, in my
Yep.
opinion, from the Big East perspective.
All right. Well, Matt and I are going to come back in the second segment. We're going to talk a little bit more about Creighton as opposed to just focusing on the Big East. We're going to talk about their star point guard who's got a nice connection to Gonzaga. But before we do that, I want to tell you all about Bet Online. College basketball may be deep into the offseason, but college football is back and the NFL is just around the corner while the WNBA playoffs are fully underway and the MLB is not far behind. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all of the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. They even have lines for coaching changes across every major sport, so even in the offseason, you can get your fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. Still want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen of the day and remind you to check out the show on YouTube if you haven't done so yet. Go hit that subscribe button. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers before the start of the college basketball season. We are very, very close. Matt, let's talk Creighton hoops. I am excited to get into this. Before we talk more generally about the team, I want to talk about their point guard, Ryan Nembhard, of course, the younger brother of former Gonzaga point guard Andrew Nembhard, now with the Indiana Pacers, highest paid second-round pick in NBA history. I pretty much say that every time I say Andrew Nembhard's name because I think that is a fun fact. Ryan had a very excellent freshman season for Creighton. I would love to hear your perspective on just watching him, seeing how he developed over the year, and what he might look like in year 2.
Well, yeah, it was unfortunate that when he started to play his best, most
Yeah.
consistent basketball, that he had kind of a freak injury that derailed the whole thing. So,
Yeah.
um, I think what you were starting to see from him, though, as he kind of, when he graduated into that area where you're a freshman on the official
Mhm.
roster, but you're not playing like one anymore.
Right.
Um, you just saw him kind of understanding how to make the right reads and plays while
Mhm.
doing it at Creighton's desired pace a little bit more
Yeah.
consistently. Because that last year's team was different. And they
Mhm.
figured out somewhere along the line that um, that their calling card was probably going to be more on the defensive end of the floor,
Yeah.
which is kind of a bucking the trend of
Mhm.
years on years on years past.
Right.
So with that, you're kind of like, okay, in terms of limiting possessions, does that behoove us to play to that style a little bit more frequently? where we can have more control on the game and dictate the terms a little bit better. And I think, when you look at Ryan Kalkbrenner, the eventual Big East Defensive Player of the Year as a sophomore breakout big man, Creighton kind of figured out, like, okay, this is where we're going to have the best chance to have the best season. And it didn't even come into the year with any kind of baseline expectation for that too, because everybody that was going to play any kind of a major role, with the exception of a couple guys, were all either freshmen or they were sophomores in their first year as in big roles, or they were newcomers at the Division I level for the first time. So it was kind of all experimentation early on, and once they figured out what their strengths as a group were, then they started to focus on, okay, how can we accentuate this to the best of their abilities to become the best team they could be. And as Ryan Nembhard started to come on, with figuring out just, when to push pace, what guys' strengths were, where to find them, how to read the floor, how to slow the game down for himself while also playing fast. That's the biggest transition that Creighton point guards deal with. And obviously watching Gonzaga point guards deal with it too. You have to be able to play fast while slowing yourself down. Very hard dynamic to figure out. But it's the reason that when you do figure it out, you become the orchestrator of an offense that's extremely tough, difficult to prepare for, and in real time. And I think the thing that's exciting about Ryan Nembhard is that it looked like he was starting to figure that out before the injury. You even go back and watch that St. John's game. That's a very open floor style because of the way St. John's plays with constant ball pressure. They'll do it from end line to end line. They force you to speed yourself up, and it's like a test. Like, can you play as fast as we're going to make you play, and will you make more mistakes than plays you'll nail? And can we capitalize off those? So that's a big test for a point guard. How under control can you be in that amount of chaos? And he was at 7 assists, no turnovers, and it looked like he was, a veteran senior out there. All sorts of different passes, all sorts of different reads, all sorts of different speeds, and you're like, wow, he's starting to get it. So that's why the injury was a little bit unfortunate, because he halted all that. So the question for him, and I think it'll determine the ceiling of this team, is how quickly can he get back to that level? Because that's kind of where he was starting to go, and how easily can he sustain it and build off of it. If it takes him until January, you might not see a non-con that goes according to expectations, especially with how difficult it is. From a schedule standpoint. But if he's there by mid-January, February, then March and April might end up looking like exactly like what everybody expects it to from a preseason standpoint, of Creighton being an elite team, a Final Four contender, a national championship contender, all those sorts of things. So it's all about when he finds that rhythm, how quickly he gets back to that St. John's game level, and then when he makes his sophomore year jump after that. Like whenever all that coincides, I feel like that will bring Creighton's offense up to its defense, and then you'll be dealing with a really, really scary group at that point, I believe.
If anybody needs advice on how to run an offense that's has Final Four aspirations, at least Ryan has the fortunate ability to ask his brother, because that was obviously what was asked of Andrew. And you kind of mentioned that there weren't a lot of preseason expectations for Creighton last year. That is not the case this year. This team has a lot of expectations kind of put on them because of Nembhard's performance, because of Kalkbrenner, and then because of some of the new additions, notably Baylor Shireman, the transfer out of South Dakota State, I believe, or South Dakota. I can't remember which one, but he's an extraordinary player. Extraordinary player coming into the program. We've seen Creighton as high as top 5, top 10. Obviously, we're talking about early September, so there's a lot of time before the games even start. But what are your thoughts kind of about those expectations based on what you saw last year? You kind of touched on a little bit with how critical of a role Nembhard is going to play, but looking at this roster at this point in the season, like what do you think this team's ceiling realistically is?
Man, I don't know. It's bizarre. Like 2 years ago, they made their first Sweet 16 in the modern era of the NCAA tournament, and then now they're now I'm hearing Final Four or bust from some people, and it's like,
right.
like when did don't you have to cross a bridge before your next
Yeah.
checkpoint is like your baseline?
Yeah.
I think I don't know.
Yeah.
It's very strange, but I can't. It's almost like this whole offseason has been about that now. So fair or not, ready or not, that's what they're gonna have to deal with. So, and honestly, from talking to the players and coaches, in bits and pieces here throughout the offseason, they think they got the goods, so they believe it. It's not really, you can't really call foul on people outside the program who think that they look like a team that could be dangerous, right?
Right.
I just have some pause about their growth, because they're still not at a point where I think back to the just a couple of years ago, just to make a fresh reference for people that people can remember that 2020 group right before the pandemic hit. They looked like a Final Four team in March. I mean, they were playing at that level. They ran through. They didn't run through the Big East, but everyone that was a contender for either that conference title or potentially go to a Final Four, the Seton Halls, the Villanovas. Creighton was the better team in all against by far. Looking at all those matchups, they handled them. They were a nightmare to deal with. So they looked like they had the goods that year. And it's funny to me because when I think about the 2019-20 team, I think about all the conversations I had about Greg McDermott not being the guy, fans being frustrated about these inconsistent results. They'd, win a game they shouldn't win, and then they'll lose to Georgetown, things like that. They got rolled by San Diego State. They didn't look like a team that you were like, okay, yeah, put them in St. Louis as a 2 seed, let them roll, see you in the Final Four, that kind of thing. But they became that. And I kind of feel like this team right now has that same type of projection to me, because I don't know if on day one they're going to look like a Final Four team.
Sure.
And I think the non-conference schedule they've put together is going to challenge them to an extreme degree. And I wouldn't be surprised if they flirt with a 500 record through that because of how difficult it is. Like, I think they're going to dog walk everybody they play at home, because the home slate is not meant to be challenging.
Right.
But they're going to go on the road at Texas. They're going to go to Maui. They're going to play BYU and Arizona State on neutral floors. Like, I could see some mixed results there. I really could.
Sure.
And if they do end up experiencing some adversity in that part of the season, I don't think it changes their ceiling.
Right.
Because I don't think that's when it's going to be determined who they are. I think if you see them get off to that good start, then maybe there's no doubt that they are that team.
Right.
And then you're just kind of checking the days until March comes around, right? But if they struggle there too, I don't think that necessarily is a nail in the coffin and that the expectations were unwarranted. I still think they could become the team that that a lot of the national pundits seem to think they are.
Right.
So it's twofold there. I think these expectations are a little unwarranted at the moment based on what they've done, but there's a lot of talent in that gym. Greg McDermott's a hell of a coach. The staff is great. They game plan as good as anyone in the country. There's a lot of reasons to be excited, I guess. So let the expectations flow. The players think they've got a Final Four roster in that locker room. If the players believe it, I can't tell the fans to calm down. So go ahead. Go nuts, everybody.
Fair enough.
This should be an interesting year.
Yeah. I wanted to switch and talk a bit more broadly about the Big East for this upcoming season. Certainly, Creighton is, by many accounts, the favorite, or at least one of the favorites to win the conference. Looking around at some of the other teams in the conference, like, how do you think this year's gonna go? Like, obviously, we're first year without Jay Wright. That's a big deal. We got Shaheem Holloway, and like, there's a lot of changes, a lot of things that are a little bit different in the Big East heading into this year. Kind of, what are your thoughts, or what are your teams that you think are really going to be, besides Creighton, who I know we're a little unsure on at this stage in the game, but what are some of the other teams that you're really excited to see this year?
Man, that's a I don't know, almost everyone.
Yeah.
When you think about the kinds of, it's not just that changes happen, it's what the changes were. Like Thad Matta's back.
Yeah.
in coaching.
Big one.
He sounded like a classic burnout case, right? Like, get me away from
Right.
this. I
Yeah.
don't want to recruit anymore. I don't want to deal with the stress of coaching.
Yeah.
So now he's back leading a Butler program that, has kind of toiled in mediocrity a little bit the last few years and couldn't really find anything consistent. Even when they got off to a good start, like they were the opposite of Creighton in 1920 before the pandemic. They were like a top 5 team.
Right.
They had looked really good. They had played Baylor to a 1-point game in Waco.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, like, they got into league play, and everyone, all the teams who were at the top of the league were just kind of pushing them around essentially.
Right.
And they didn't, and then they had a bad pandemic year, bad COVID year. And then they had some injuries at the end of it too, which didn't help the situation. Some key ones that were long lasting that affected their season this previous year.
Right.
So that kind of left Laval Jordan in a bad spot. You really, I don't think what happened to him was a good deal. I don't think he was a bad coach. I think he just ran into some tough luck and couldn't find some consistent footing. So they made a change, and Ed Matta's back. So interesting, because I didn't think he was anywhere on the radar of coaching a high-level D1 program ever again, just because of the way he left Ohio State. When he left Ohio State, it seemed like he had just been burnt out on the profession itself and couldn't deal with it anymore. Butler is not exactly a low-pressure situation.
No.
Those fans want to win. They believe they should win. And when you're in the Big East, if you're not trying to win, you're going to get drowned. So that's interesting. Sean Miller is back at Xavier. That's also very interesting because he's a coach who I think has a lot of, cachet in the business as an elite recruiter, as someone who can win at a high level. However, there was a narrative around him about the ceiling that his talented teams could not breach. And they would get eliminated by teams that were lesser talented than them on a frequent basis, right? So there's questions there, like, what is Xavier's ceiling with Sean Miller back in the mix? That's interesting because Xavier's got a lot back. They won the NIT last year. They have a lot of talent back from that squad.
It's a good team.
And obviously Sean Miller is, a good coach. He can win at a high level. So interesting, right? Like maybe they're the favorites to win the league. Who knows? I think they get lost in the sauce a little bit considering what they have coming back, compared to Creighton. Because by the way, they swept Creighton last year. So that's an interesting team too. UConn's always interesting because they talk a lot and they're always going to bark and you never really know if they have any bite until one year they do. So they're always interesting. Villanova, I feel like, is getting disrespected to a level that I don't believe is safe for people to do. Because I think Kyle Neptune is a hell of a coach.
He's a great
coach.
I
just think he doesn't have the documentation to prove it like Jay Wright does, right? But he was part of those special Villanova teams. So I think he kind of knows what it takes to get there. And I think people are playing a really dangerous game if they think Villanova in a post Jay Wright world, hang out with St. John's, Georgetown, DePaul next year. Careful how much you poke the bear that is just sleeping and you think is dead. And then year 2, Shaka Marquette, he had them off to a great start, but some things got exposed as the year went on. What does year 2 look like? Providence is replacing a ton. But that seems like a way for them. Honestly, that might be the way they survive in the transfer portal era, if we can call it that. Because you either have to decide what your identity as a program is. Are you going to recruit freshmen at a very high level, and then develop them into players that can turn into veterans that can help you make deep NCAA tournament runs every 2 to 3, 4 years, or are you going to stock the cabinet full of veteran-laden transfers that all want to win, that all are great culture guys, that all want to all know what it takes to be on the same page and have a collective goal in mind, and that way you can counteract some of the things that are disadvantageous to you in recruiting.
Right.
That, like when you stack yourself up against a UConn or a
Mhm.
St. John's or a Nova, where you're losing those battles
Yep.
to high school kids who don't know any better.
Mhm.
Maybe going after the transfer portal harder is the way your program survives in this
Yep.
era.
Makes sense.
So they don't have a lot back from last year, but that's okay because
Mhm.
Ed Cooley's a hell of a coach, and maybe
Yeah.
he picked the right transfers, and they'll be just fine. So
Mhm.
they're interesting. I think
Yeah.
it's wide open
Yeah.
because I told you how I feel that I don't think Creighton's at their peak yet.
Right.
So I think they might have some bumps in the road while they get to that point.
Mhm.
As they're going through that process, the other teams in the league maybe get a leg up on them,
Mhm.
and by the time they meet in March, everyone's kind of at a high level. So I think the league is really strong, and I don't know if there's a clear favorite. Obviously, from the outside looking in, Creighton is the clear favorite because of the
Mhm.
way they ended last year, despite not having Kalkbrenner for that Kansas game,
Yeah.
despite not having Nembhard down the stretch of the season. Big East tournament final, playing Nova to the wire before Colin Gillespie went crazy,
Yeah.
and then pushing Kansas, who ended up winning the national championship, pushing them all the way
Mhm.
to the wire without Kalkbrenner on the floor at all. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a pretty impressive
No doubt.
springboard to your second season with that core group. So
Mhm.
I get it why they're the favorite, and I just think the rest of the league isn't that far off.
This sounds like it's going to be an incredibly fun season in the Big East. And I got to say, being able to have conversations about who's going to win a league and being able to talk about 6, 7, 8 teams as opposed to the current WCC. I'm a champion of the WCC. I love the WCC, but that's not how these conversations go. It's not how those conversations have gone in the last 20 years. So it's nice to be able to, having.
Do you enjoy that as the
be,
perennial favorite by far? Do you enjoy that
No,
designation?
I mean, no, not really. I think for Gonzaga fans, it was hard that last year was a disappointment and they went to the Sweet 16 for the 7th consecutive year. That
Mhm.
shouldn't be a disappointment.
I
But it
know.
was not only a disappointment for some people, it was a massive disappointment. And they
Yeah.
lost to a good Arkansas team. Yeah, they probably should have won. They had some really poor shooting nights. Julian Strother, Andrew Nembhard, I think, combined to score one basket in that game. They should have won, but they didn't, and that happens. But Gonzaga's expectations are just so high right now, and their conference is not really helping in that regard. You look at a conference like the Big East, there might be years where they're expected to finish third. And I think some fans, that makes them a little nervous, and I understand that. But for me, I think that's better. That's more fun because what? Third place in the Big East, that team could still win a national championship.
Mhm.
You finished third in the WCC, you probably don't make the NCAA tournament. This year you
Mhm.
did because it was San Francisco. They got bounced in the first round with an unfortunate draw against Murray State, which was a bummer. But that's a huge. The third, I don't even know who finished third in the Big East last year. Was it Providence or were they second? Whoever it was probably a top 5 seed.
UConn was a 3 seed.
Yeah, exactly. That's crazy and fun and cool. And that's why, for me, I didn't voice my opinion on this show. I voiced it on previous episodes. Gonzaga to the Big East would be incredibly fun for a
Mhm.
thousand reasons, but that's among them. It's getting to be in a conference where 5, 6 teams have realistic chances of competing, not just to win the Big East tournament, but to win the NCAA tournament as well, or at least go to a Sweet 16 or an Elite 8. That's the fun, that's the appeal. And hearing this recap of the Big East and what this upcoming season might look like is just further proof that Gonzaga needs to get involved here however they can.
For sure.
All right, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a phenomenal episode. I hope that Gonzaga and Creighton get a chance to play each other in the near future, either as conference mates. Potentially they'll run into each other again in the NCAA tournament. May not be something I'm guessing Creighton fans maybe don't want to see Drew Timme in the NCAA tournament again if they can avoid it. But hopefully, I think these are two of the best teams in college basketball, and I'm excited to see how their years go.
For sure. Hey, always a pleasure to talk to you, man, whether it's privately or on podcasts. Love it. And I hope we can be conference mates sooner than later.
All right, well, that is going to do it for me today, folks. Thank you for listening to the show. Thanks to Matt for joining me on the episode. We got another great week of shows coming up next week. For now, enjoy your weekend and go Zags.